Hello, Canisius. Father Zanoni here. Having been a teacher at the school for so many years, I recently returned to serve as an assistant to Father Ciancimino, as you know. But not being a teacher now, I really don't have the opportunities to get to know you students as well as I really wish I could. And during this pandemic, I want you to know that I really miss seeing all of you around the corridors of our school. And I hope and I pray that you and your families are healthy and safe and that you remain so. Now, our seniors have graduated and the school year has come to an end, and we suffered a terrible loss this spring. No spring sports programs. We had done so well in the fall and in the winter, and I was really looking forward to the spring and especially to the baseball season, because when I first came to Canisius as a Jesuit scholastic and not yet a priest, I was an assistant baseball coach for 3 seasons, starting in 1970 under Connie McGillicuddy, our legendary teacher and coach, whose portrait hangs on the wall outside of our chapel, as you know. And by the way, in those days, our baseball hats looked something like this. Notice the red. There's a story there for some other time. And I have a photo here of Mr. Mack and myself at Delaware Park after a baseball practice on a Saturday morning in 1971. You know, this year our school celebrates its 150th anniversary, and I thought you might be interested in what I consider a significant moment in the history of Canisius baseball. Excuse me. In 1971, 49 years ago, the Crusaders won their very first Georgetown Cup championship. And things, of course, were very different in those days. For one, there were many more Catholic high schools in the area. Many of them have closed by now, but in those days, there were so many schools that the Monsignor Martin League had to create 2 divisions, the Bishop Burke division and the Bishop Smith division. This Monsignor Martin must have been some kind of a Monsignor to outrank 2 bishops. But anyway, if my memory serves me right, in the Bishop Burke division, we had Canisius and St. Joe's, Bishop Timon, Cardinal O'Hara, Bishop Fallon, which was on Main Street, Cardinal Doherty, which was in the north of the city on the west side, Bishop Duffy in Niagara Falls, Bishop Ryan in Kaisertown, Bishop Turner on the east side of the city, and Bishop Newman in Williamsville. And the Smith division, the Bishop Smith division, had schools such as St. Francis at Athol Springs, St. Mary's at Lancaster, Walsh in Olean, DeSales in Lockport, Notre Dame in Batavia, Minzenti in Dunkirk, Baker Victory in Lackawanna, and Bishop Gibbons in North Tonawanda. Now, generally at that time, the schools would play each other in their various sports in the division, and then at the end of the season, they would meet the other schools in the other division in playoffs. And that's exactly what happened in baseball. So at the end of the regular season, the top 4 teams from the Bishop Burke division would meet the top 4 teams from the Bishop Smith division. Now, Delaware Park in those days had 4 active baseball diamonds. And so on the Saturday after the season ended, the 8 teams would arrive at the park and they'd be matched up. You know, the first from Bishop Burke would play the 4th from Bishop Smith, and the second would play the 3rd, et cetera, et cetera. And they'd play a game simultaneously, all 4 games going on. And at the end of the first round, there'd be time for a cookout and a picnic. And then the winners of the first round, those 4 teams, would play off against each other in the afternoon. And then at the end of the afternoon, of course, you had 2 teams standing. And they would be given a couple days to rest and regroup. And later on in the week, they would play 1 final game to determine a championship. So that's how the playoffs worked in those days, and very different from today. Well, in 1970, that was my first year with the club, and we had a very good team, led by Mike Connolly and Jim Zadora and Chris Burns, who was a terrific hitter. He's now a U.S. federal judge in town. Yet Canisius, as it would have it, lost in the playoffs to Cardinal Doherty, which fielded a very talented team that year. So it was wait till next year. So in the spring of 1971, there was a student at our school, a junior, who was a writer for our school newspaper, the Citadel. His name was Eric Brady, and I hope you know that name, because Eric went on to become a very talented and highly respected and regarded journalist really throughout the country. In any event, he wrote this article kind of previewing the season and talking about our first early games that we had played already. And he said that, we had high hopes for a successful season. Well, the team did not disappoint Eric or the school, because the Crusaders finished first in the Burke Division that year. So when the season ended, the Saturday after that season ended, the Crusaders went to the park, Delaware Park, to face off in the first round against Baker Victory from Lackawanna, and they defeated them. And then in the second round, they ended up playing Notre Dame from Batavia, and they not only beat them in the game, but they no-hit them. The other school that emerged from the playoffs victorious that day was Bishop Turner. So Canisius was to play Turner in the final championship game a few days later, which they did after school. We went up to Delaware Park, and I remember the day. The skies were very cloudy, but still about 1,000 fans really showed up, and they, gathered around the ball field to watch the game. The Crusaders were the visiting team, so we led off the game, and after the first out was recorded, our shortstop, David Butler, singled. John Bushka, our starting pitcher, the next batter, singled, so we had first and second. Our next batter made out, so it was first and second, 2 out. And our catcher, Pete Curtin, came to the plate. Pete was a very strong athlete. Right now he's a very successful doctor out in San Francisco. Anyway, he slashed a single into the outfield, and Dave Butler rounded third and scored a run. Our next batter made out, so the first inning, top of the first inning was over, but we were very content. We had a run on the board in a championship game. Things were looking good. But of course, in a championship game, you can imagine you're facing 2 very good pitchers and 2 very good ball clubs. And Turner had a very good pitcher that day. His name was John Otochowski, if I remember right. And we had a good pitcher too, John Bushka. So at the end of the game, when the last out was recorded, Canisius did in fact win the Georgetown Cup for its very first time, having defeated Bishop Turner, but the final score was 1-0. Quite a game. Now that championship team was composed of many talented players and some very fine young men. So beside the 3 that I already mentioned, our starting lineup included Bobby Daly, and Jim Zadora, Gary Toomey, Pete Smith, Kevin Kinney, and Charlie Grudner. And some of the underclassmen who were on the squad that year and subsequent years, I'd like to mention some of them: Charlie Weber and Vinny Guadagna, Joe Bremer, Tim Horahan, Joe Schwalbach, Tony Manzella, who's on our board of trustees, Scott Barry, Jim Valley, Gene Rudzinski, Jack Kaminska, Mark Cosgrove, Carl Emmerling, Steve Chanacki, Mark Polito, all very fine young men. And they would all make their own mark in the next few seasons, because in 1972 and in 1973, the Crusaders repeated and they three-peated, 3 consecutive Georgetown Cups. And since then, primarily under the leadership of Brian Tenney, who retired recently, as you know, he played for Mr. Mack in the 1970s, and he also, in later years, became the varsity head coach in place of Mr. Mack. The Crusaders, under Mr. Tenney's leadership, would win many, many Georgetown Cups afterwards. But that first Georgetown Cup has to be sweet, don't you think? I certainly think it is. Well, I hope you enjoyed learning a bit about this important moment in Canisius sports history. And I want to say this to all of you. In every sport, there's so much more history to make. And I encourage you to make your own unique contribution to the blue and gold and become part of our outstanding athletic tradition. Peter Canisius, pray for us. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you and all of your loved ones.